So, another story from Grimm's fairy tales, The Goose Girl at the Well. There was once an old woman, almost as old as the hills, who lived with a flock of geese in a wilderness between two mountains where she had a small house. The wilderness was surrounded by a dense forest, and every morning the old woman took her crutches and stumped into the forest. Here she was more active than you would have imagined such a very old woman could be. She gathered grapes for her grasses for her geese, picked as many wild berries as she could reach with her hands, and carried all home on her back. One morning a fine young fellow came tramping through the forest. So far he had met no one, and then suddenly he saw the old crone kneeling on the ground, mowing her grass with a sickle. She had stuffed a large bundle in her satchel and had two baskets stood near filled with wild pears and crab apples. "Mother," said he, "you'll never be able to carry all that." "I must carry it all, pretty gentleman," she said. "Rich people's children won't need such things, but the poor peasant has a saying, 'Be careful of the odds and ends.' Would you like to help me?" The young man felt sorry for the old woman. "My father is no peasant," he said. "I'm the son of a rich count, but to show that it is not only peasants who can carry burdens, I will take your bundle." "If you'll only try," said the old woman, "I shall indeed be grateful. It's about an hour's walk, and you'll have to take the pears and apples too." The young count was a little dismayed when he heard what the distance was, but the old woman was not going to let him off. She bound the bundle of grass on his back and slung the baskets on his arms. "You see," she said, "how easy it is." "No," replied the count, "it's not easy," and his expression became pained. "The bundle is as heavy as if it were chock full of rocking stones, and the apples and pears are as weighty as if they were made of lead." He wanted to free himself of his burdens in a few minutes, but the old crone would not allow him to rest. "Look now," she exclaimed in a mocking voice, "the fine young gentleman can't carry what an old woman has borne on her back 100 times." So long as the way lay over level ground, he could endure. But when they came to the mountainside and had to climb, and the loose stones rolled under his feet as if they were alive, his strength was almost exhausted. Perspiration poured off his brow, and shivers ran down his back. "Mother," he said, "I can't go on. I must rest a little." "Nothing of this kind," said the relentless witch. When we get home, you shall rest, not before. So push on. The exercise will do you a deal of good." "You shameless old hag!" exclaimed the count, and tried to throw off the bundle, but in vain, for it was so firmly fastened on his shoulders that it might have grown there. The old woman laughed heartily at his attempts and danced around him on her crutches. "Don't lose your temper, pretty sir," said she. "Carry your bundle patiently, and when you get home I'll give you your reward." What could he do? He was obliged to trudge on and resign himself to the old creature's tyranny. She seemed to grow more and more nimble, while he was weighed down more than ever. Once with a spring she leapt onto the top of the bundle, and though she was shriveled and thin as a broomstick, her weight exceeded that of the most buxom peasant girl. The youth's knees trembled and bent under him, but the old woman drove him on with a switch and with kicks on the legs. Under pressure, he arrived at last at the old woman's house, ready to drop from fatigue. When the geese saw the old woman, they spread their wings, craned their necks, and flew towards her, crying, "Willie, Willie!" Behind the flocks came a strapping lass with a stick in her hand. Tall and muscular, she was as ugly as darkness itself. The old woman now clambered down from her perch and relieved the count of the bundle and the baskets. She looked at him with quite friendly eyes and said in a pleasing tone, Sit down on that bench, and you shall have the reward and refreshment you have so honestly earned." Then she turned to the goose girl and said, "Go into the house, dearest daughter. It won't do you to be alone with a young, good looking gentleman. He might fall in love with you." The count hardly knew whether to laugh or to cry. Such a beauty as that, he thought. Even if she were 30 years younger, I shouldn't look at her. Meanwhile, the old woman caressed and stroked her geese as if they had been babies, and then followed her daughter into the house. The youth stretched himself on a bench in the shade of an apple tree. The air was soft and cool. Round him stretched a green meadow, thickly carpeted with cowslips, wild thyme, and 1,000 other flowers. "It is very charming here," the count said, "but I am so tired I cannot keep my eyes open. I'll take a nap." After he had been asleep a short while, the old woman came and shook him. "Get up," she said. "You mustn't stay here. I've given you a bad time of it, truly, but it hasn't cost you your life. Here's your reward. You are in no need of money or land, so I give you this." She handed him a small box carved out of an emerald. "Take care of it," she said. "It'll bring you happiness." The count sprang to his feet, conscious that his weariness had fled and that he was as strong and fit as ever. He thanked the old woman for her present, and without turning his head to get another glimpse of the fair daughter, he departed. The count wandered for 3 days before he found the way out of the wilderness. Then he came to a great town, and as no one knew him, he was led to the royal castle where the king and queen sat on the throne. The count dropped on one knee, drew out the emerald box, and laid it at the feet of the queen. She bade him rise and give the knick-knack into her hands. Scarcely had she opened it and looked inside than she fell to the ground in a dead faint. The count was instantly taken into custody and led to prison. Thereupon the queen opened her eyes and cried, "Let him come back." Then she ordered everyone to go away and leave her to have a private conversation with a stranger. When the queen was alone with him, she began to cry bitterly. "Of what avail is all this pomp and splendor when every morning I wake up full of care and sorrow? I've had 3 daughters, the youngest of whom was a miracle of loveliness. She was white as snow, as pink as apple blossom, and her hair shone like sunbeams. When she cried, she shed tears that were pearls and precious stones. The king, when she was 15 years old, ordered all 3 daughters to come before the throne. You should have seen the admiration of the courtiers when the youngest came in. It was like the rising sun. The king said, 'My daughter, I do not know when my end may come, but I will decide today that each of you shall have at my death. You all love me, but the one of you who loves me the most shall have the largest share.' Each daughter said she loved him best. 'Cannot you express,' asked the king, 'how much you love me, and then I shall be able to judge?' The eldest said, 'I love my father more than sweet honey.' The second, 'I love my father more than my prettiest frock.' But the youngest was silent. 'And you, my dear child,' asked the father, 'how much do you love me?' 'I do not know,' she answered, 'and cannot compare my love with anything.' But the king insisted that she must mention something. So she said at last, 'The best dishes have no flavor without salt. I love my father as much as I love salt.' When the king heard this answer, he became furious and said, 'If your love for me resembles nothing better than salt, it shall be rewarded with salt.' Thereupon he divided the kingdom between the 2 elder daughters, but the youngest, with a sack of salt tied to her back, was led into the wild forest by two servants and left there alone. Soon afterwards, the king repented his severity and harshness and sent people out to look for her in the forest, but she was nowhere to be found. Imagine my feelings when I opened the emerald box to see a pearl lying in it exactly like one of my daughter's tears. Please tell me how you came by this treasure. The count related how the old woman in the wood had given it to him. He believed her to be a witch. Of the queen's lost daughter he had heard and seen nothing. The queen and king then resolved to look up the old woman, for they naturally thought that in the quarter the pearl had come from news of their child might be gleaned. The old woman was sitting in a house in the wilderness spinning. It was already dark, and a log on a smouldering hearth gave but a feeble light. Suddenly there was a fluttering and cackling without, and the geese were driven home from the meadow. In a few minutes her daughter came in. The old woman scarcely noticed her and shook her palsied head. The daughter sat down, took her spinning wheel too, and made it hum as young women do, the threads flying. Thus they sat together for 2 hours without speaking a word. At last something rattled the window, and two fiery eyes glowered through the pane. It was an old screech owl, and its tit wit hoo made the old dame look up and say, "Now, daughter, it's time. Go out to your work." The daughter stood up and went out. Where did she go? Over the meadows, on, till she came to the valley. She stopped by a well where three oak trees grew. The moon, meanwhile, had risen in a great silver ball over the mountains. It was so light you could have found a pin. The girl drew a mask from her face and began to wash in the well. When she had finished, she threw the skin she had washed off in the water and lay down on the grass to dry in the moonlight. You never saw such a transformation. Instead of a mud-colored plait, gold locks like sunbeams broke loose from the girl's head and spread round till they enveloped her whole figure like a mantle. Her eyes shone through her tresses like stars in the sky, and her cheeks bloomed with the soft pink of apple blossom. But the beautiful maiden was sad. She sat down and cried bitterly, and one tear after another splashed through her hair on to the ground. There she sat, and would have sat a long time had not the bushes crackled and snapped behind her. She sprang up like a deer at the sound of the sportsman's shot. Just like a black cloud covered the moons, and the girl again slipped into the old dark skin and disappeared like a light blown out by the wind. Trembling all over like an aspen leaf, she ran into the house again. The old woman stood at the door, and the girl was going to tell her what had happened when the witch laughed gaily and said she knew all about it. She went into the parlor and threw on another log, but she did not sit down again to her spinning wheel, but fetched a broom and began to sweep and dust. "Everything must be clean and tidy," she remarked to the girl. "But mother," said the girl, "why do you begin work at such a late hour? What's going to happen?" "Don't you know what time it is?" asked the old woman. "Not quite midnight," answered the girl. "Not much after 11. "Have you not thought," went on the old woman, that it is 3 years today since you came to me? Your time is up. We cannot stay together longer." The girl looked frightened and said, "Oh, dear mother, don't cast me out. Where shall I go?" The old woman did not wish to reveal to the girl the fate in store for her. "I haven't long to stay here," she said, "but before I leave, the house must be cleaned thoroughly. So don't interrupt me in my work. You needn't be afraid. You will have a roof over your head, come what may, and the reward I'm going to give you will be ample for your wants. Go to your room, wash off your dark skin, put on the silk dress you wore when you came here, and then wait till I call you." But now we must go back to the king and queen who, accompanied by the count, had gone into the wilderness to look for the old woman. The count in the forest got separated from them and had to go on alone. The next day he thought he was on the right path and walked on and on till night fell. Then he climbed a tree where he intended to sleep, for he was afraid he might lose his way in the dark. When the moon rose and lit up the landscape, he saw a figure coming down the mountain. He recognized the same Goose girl, though she had no stick in her hand, that he had seen in the old woman's garden. But how astounded was he when he saw the girl go to the well, take off her skin, wash, and let down her beautiful golden tresses. He had never seen anyone so beautiful in his life. He scarcely dared breathe, but stretched out his head as far as it would go from his bower of foliage to gaze at her. Perhaps he stretched too far, for the bough he was on snapped, and at the same moment the lovely apparition hastily resumed her old skin and fled like a deer. And as just then a cloud came over the moon, he lost sight of her. The minute after she had vanished, the count came down from the tree and followed the direction she had taken. He had not gone far before he saw the king and queen, who had seen the light shining from the window of the old woman's house and were making for it. The count told them of the wonderful transformation he had witnessed by the well, and they were sure the beautiful girl must be their lost daughter. In great glee they continued their way and soon came to the old woman's little house. The strangers looked in at the window and saw the old woman at her spinning wheel. The little parlor was as spick and span as if the little fairymen lived there, who cannot bear a speck of dust on their feet. The king and queen summoned up courage and knocked softly on the window pane. The old woman appeared to expect them. She got up and exclaimed in a friendly tone, "Come in, I know who you are." When they had walked into the parlor, the old woman said, "You might have spared yourself this journey if 3 years ago you had not unjustly spurned your child, who is so good and lovely. But you really did no harm after all. For 3 years she has tended my geese, and in that time her pure heart has remained unsullied. But the anxiety you have suffered on her account has long ago punished you enough." Then she went to the bedroom door and called, "Come out now, dear little one." The door opened and the princess appeared in her silken draperies with her golden hair and shining eyes and complexion like apple blossom. She embraced and kissed her father and mother, and all of them wept for joy. The young count stood by, and when she saw him, she blushed, and she knew not why, till she looked like a moss rose. The king then said, "My child, I have now bequeathed my kingdom to the others. What shall I give you?" "She needs nothing," the old dame interposed. "I will give you her the tears she has shed for you. They are priceless pearls, more beautiful than those found in the sea, and worth more than 100 kingdoms. And in reward for her services, I shall make her a present of my little house." As the old woman said this, the walls creaked a little, and the old woman vanished before their eyes. On looking round, they saw the small dwelling had changed into a magnificent palace, and a long table stood ready, laid with flunkies running hither and thither. There is more of the story, but my grandmother, who told to me, had not a good memory, and she had forgotten the rest. I have no idea that the beautiful princess was married to the count. I have an idea, that the beautiful princess was married to the count, and they lived together in the fairy palace, happy and content. Whether the white geese who were fed in the pasture by the little house were maidens whom the old woman had brought home with her at one time or another, and were now changed back into human beings again as maids of honor of the young queen. I do not know, but I think it probable. One thing is certain, the old woman was not a wicked witch at all, but a wise woman who meant to do good. Most likely it was she who, at the prince's birth, endowed her with the gift of shedding pearls instead of tears. So this is a beautiful tale written by the Grimm brothers.